formerly the main commercial catch, went extinct. 63 A few thousand Canadian and American fishermen lost their jobs to the sea lamprey, and the remainder went after smaller, low-value species. In 1958, a chemical poison began to control lamprey populations. Combined with pollution control and stocking, this helped some fish populations to recover after about 1970, but commercial and sport fishing on the lakes has yet to recover from the eruption of the sea lamprey. 64. The zebra mussel is a striped mollusk, native to the Black and Caspian Seas. It hitched a ride to the Great Lakes in ballast water in 1985 or 1986. In 1988, it was discovered in Lake St. Clair, between Lakes Huron and Erie. By 1996, it had colonized all the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence, Illinois, Ohio, Tennessee, Arkansas, and most of the Mississippi rivers. The zebra mussel filters water to feed and removes numerous pollutants and algae, leaving cleaner and clearer water wherever it goes. Preferring hard, smooth surfaces, it delighted in the industrial infrastructure of the Great Lakes region, building thick colonies that sank navigational buoys and clogged water intakes on factories, power plants, and municipal water filtration systems. By the early 1990s, it had temporarily shut down a Ford Motor plant, a Michigan town's water power supply, and cost the United States about $1 billion a year. In dollar terms, it threatened to become the most costly invader in U.S. history, a distinction previously held by the boll weevil. 65. The saga of the zebra mussel was but one episode in a costly biotic exchange between America and the Soviet Union. In 1979 or 1980, a comb jellyfish, native to the Atlantic coast of the Americas, stowed away on a ship bound for a northern Black Sea port. Amid highly polluted and anoxic waters, it found ecological nirvana as few species ever had, devouring zooplankton, larvae, and fish eggs. Nothing in the Black Sea would eat it. By 1988, it dominated life in the Black Sea, accounting by one estimate for 95% of its wet biomass. It obliterated fisheries worth $250 million per year, mainly in the Sea of Azov, at a time when Russians and Ukrainians could ill afford it, helping in a modest way to nudge the USSR into the dustbin of history. 66. So, in the tense Cold War atmosphere of the early 1980s, American ecosystems launched a first strike with the comb jelly, and the USSR's biota retaliated with the zebra mussel. The damaging exchange probably resulted from the failures of Soviet agriculture, which prompted the grain trade from North America: more trade, more ships, more ballast water. In any case, the huge expansion of modern shipping and the wide use of ballast water tanks brought about a partial homogenization of the world's coastal, harbor, and estuarine species. It is a distant echo of the Columbian Exchange, the dispersal of organisms that followed 1492. Like the Columbian Exchange, its consequences were mixed. The comb jelly did no good, but a stowaway Japanese clam became the basis of a thriving fishery in British Columbia and the state of Washington after 1930. For better and for worse, every seaway since 1880 became a highway for aquatic exchange. 67. Control of bioinvasions. The greatest service which can be rendered to any country is to add a useful plant to its culture. So thought Thomas Jefferson. Keeping the harmful ones out should rank high as well. The economic costs of bioinvasions occasionally mounted so high as to mobilize resistance movements. Before the age of pesticides, this meant biological control, finding a predator or disease that would attack the invader. Normally the search took place in the invader's home territory, and normally, more than 85% of the time, it failed. The United States imported over 40 enemies of the gypsy moth after 1890, none of which controlled it. Some attempts were worse than failures. Late in the 19th century, when New Zealand had problems with introduced rats and cats, someone imported weasels, ferrets, and stoats to eat the rats and cats. But they proved disobedient, and joined the rats and cats in a general assault on New Zealand's native birds, most of which went extinct. 68. Up to 1976, there were 56 more or less successful cases of biological control of plants, of which 2 were signal successes: the use of a moth against the prickly pear cactus in Australia, and the case of St. Johnswort and the Chrysalina beetle. prickly pear cactus arrived in Australia from North America as an ornamental garden plant but soon escaped, and by the 1920s it covered an area the size of Colorado or Italy. Australian scientists scoured North America for cactus eaters, and in 1925 found Cactoblastis cactorum, a moth, which rolled back the cactus frontier. St. Johnswort is a European native that in the western United States and Australia became an aggressive weed, called Klamath weed in California. It crowded out useful pasture grasses and made livestock sickly. It appeared in California around 1900 and by 1944 covered 2 million acres of rangeland. Various British and French beetles were enlisted in the struggle against it, with no success. But in 1944, when war inhibited the search for useful European beetles, an import from Australia successfully acclimatized in California, and within 10 years nibbled Klamathweed back to 1% of its former domain, to the great satisfaction of California cattlemen. Few biocontrol programs worked as well as these two, because few creatures are choosy enough in their eating habits, although as the science of biocontrol grew more refined, the probability of favorable results perhaps improved. 69. One recent shining success in biocontrol restored Africa's broad cassava belt to health after 1993. Cassava, a Brazilian root crop imported to Africa in the 16th century, by 1990 supported some 200 million Africans. In 1970, a cassava mite, also Brazilian, began to colonize Africa's cassava fields, radiating in all directions from a foothold in Uganda. Unlucky farmers lost half their crops, and no pesticides or other control techniques worked. Then, after 10 years' search in South America, entomologists found the answer: another mite that ferociously pursued and ate the cassava mite. Released first in Benin in 1993, the predator mite quickly checked the havoc caused by the cassava mite, raising cassava yields in West Africa by about a third. 70. The perfect predator or parasite, one that will attack a targeted pest and nothing else, is always hard to find. The difficulties of biological control made pesticides an appealing option in dealing with runaway exotics. This worked on the sea lamprey, but in many other cases, such as the fire ant and gypsy moth, it failed, and inadvertently poisoned millions of creatures, people included, who happened to be in the way. In general, the transport revolutions of modern times and the vast scale of human disturbance to ecosystems in the 20th century have refashioned the planet in ways very suitable to invasive species. Fast-breeding, mobile generalists inherited a much larger share of the Earth, promoting a grand intercontinental and interoceanic homogenization of flora and fauna. 71 islands were especially changed, half of New Zealand's flora is exotics, and so were the lands of the European overseas frontiers. 72. The whole process, one of the great biotic revolutions in Earth's history, tended to enhance local biodiversity while reducing it globally. In 1958, Charles Elton wrote, "We must make no mistake, we are seeing one of the great historical convulsions of the world's fauna and flora." 73. In the 21st century, the pace of invasions is not likely to slacken, and new genetically engineered organisms may also occasionally achieve ecological release and fashion dramas of their own. Biodiversity and the sixth extinction. The 20th century, a blip of geological time, may be an early stage in a mass extinction, the likes of which have occurred 5 times since life on Earth began. The greatest of these extinction spasms happened about 245 million years ago and swept away perhaps 9/10 of marine species. The most recent such spasm, about 65 million years ago, ended the career of dinosaurs and paved the way for mammals. Each extinction event spells opportunity for survivors. Most species that ever lived are now extinct. Somewhere around 14 million now exist. 74 Extinction background rates, while not constant, suggest that on average over eons 1 to 3 species vanish every year. Every 200 years or so, on average, a mammal ought to go extinct. Human exploration, settlement of new lands, forest clearance, and hunting quickened the pace. Since AD 1600, at least 484 animals and 654 plants have gone extinct. Most extinctions happened on islands and in freshwater lakes and rivers, isolated habitats. The 20th century extinction rate for mammals was about 40 times the background rate, for birds about 1,000 times background. Roughly 1% of the birds and mammals extant in 1900 went extinct by 1995.75. Previous extinction spasms derived from unknown causes, but the modern one, if it is that, is different in that its cause is obvious: a rogue mammal's economic activity. Nothing of the sort has ever happened before in Earth's history. Most modern extinctions occurred because of habitat loss, although some derived from hunting or predation by introduced species. 76. The world-girdling assault on tropical forests necessarily heightened extinction rates, because roughly half of terrestrial species live in tropical forests. Those forests became increasingly fragmented, creating islands of wildlife habitat amid newly created fields, scorched earth, and artificial lakes. Numerous animal populations lost contact with others of their ilk and were thus in the 20th century consigned to eventual extinction, the living dead, although they may hang on for decades or even centuries. While expert views are numerous, many observers expect 30 to 50% of terrestrial species to disappear in the next century or two. If it happens, it will be the sixth great extinction event in Earth's history, far faster than any previous one, and unique in its cause. All this belongs to the future. Like climate change or ozone depletion, the erosion of biodiversity certainly happened in the 20th century, but its societal impact as yet remains small. 77. While reducing the number of species on Earth, human agency improved the prospects of a handful of chosen species. These include domesticated plants and animals, our minion biota, and synanthropes such as rats, rabbits, cockroaches, sparrows, raccoons, crabgrass, and the viruses that cause the common cold. Roughly 40 animals and 100 plants have greatly expanded their numbers and range through domestication. 78. Human population growth and ceaseless toil remade landscapes and ecosystems so as to maximize the populations of the minion biota. By the 1980s, domesticates accounted for 15% of the planet's animal biomass, versus 5% for people. Consider, for example, the population history of the most important domesticated animals, shown in Table 8. 2. Except for the horse, which fell from grace when internal combustion engines took its job after 1920, each of these domesticates grew much more numerous in the 20th century. Sheep, goats, and chickens enjoyed a reproductive and survival riot, multiplying even faster than their human masters. Of course, most of the minion biota was butchered and eaten by people. Its demographic success was contingent upon our tastes and appetites. That success was a direct result of our efforts to turn ever larger portions of the biosphere's energy and materials to our own purposes. The complementary success of synanthropes in the niches we inadvertently created is an indirect result of the same grand process. 79. Table 8.2 Global Livestock Population, 1890-1990 Conclusion. In his theses on Feuerbach, Marx complained that philosophers only interpreted history, but the point was to change it. In the 20th century, humankind not only interpreted biological evolution but profoundly changed it. Since at least the first domestication of plants and animals, humankind has influenced biological evolution. But lately that influence has become, in more and more instances, governing. Long ago, cultural evolution replaced biological evolution as the chief agent of change in human affairs. In the 20th century, human cultural evolution impinged upon, and in cases entirely controlled, the biological evolution of other species as well. For people, the most powerful changes in the 20th century were those in disease regimes and in agriculture. These were sharp and fundamental changes in the human condition, affecting billions of people in matters of life and death. The changes in forests, fisheries, bioinvasions, and biodiversity made less difference from the human point of view. Naturally, a Dayak tribesman from Borneo, expelled from ancestral land to make room for a clear-cut, or a California sardine fisherman thrown out of work might see things differently. So would trees and fish. I have taken the anthropocentric point of view, and within that, the view that billions of people are more important than millions or thousands. Other viewpoints exist. That said, in the longer run, the erosion of biodiversity or the consequences of bioinvasions may yet prove to be more consequential than disease control or the Green Revolution. The range of possible outcomes from these changes are tremendous. They may prove modest, especially if the tendencies of the 20th century are somehow checked. They may prove large beyond imagination. The history of the 21st century will make such matters clearer. From the very long-term perspective, humanity in its high-energy phase may resemble cyanobacteria of 2 billion years ago. Those diminutive creatures, whose descendants are blue-green algae, pioneered new metabolic paths, as we have recently done, and refashioned the world in the process. They excreted oxygen while using hydrogen from water, thus raising the oxygen concentration in the air from 1 part per trillion to the current 1 in 5. This conveniently poisoned most other bacteria, to which oxygen was toxic, and made more room for more cyanobacteria and other oxygen-tolerant creatures. Humankind used more tools than simple oxygen poisoning, but took steps down the same path, toward a biosphere of our making. It is not one of our choosing, however, as we are scarcely more conscious of the process than were cyanobacteria. Part 2. Engines of Change. Toda la historia y solamente la narración del trabajo de ajuste y los combats entre la naturaleza extrahumana y la naturaleza humana. José Martí, Obras Completas 2344, 5. The Cuban intellectual José Martí at the end of the 19th century recognized that history unfolded amid environmental changes wrought, in turn, by history. The momentous social, economic, and political changes of the 20th century took place in tandem with equally great changes in the environment. Why did so much environmental change happen in the 20th century? Why not before? How did it all happen? Within each of the foregoing chapters, I have offered answers involving several specific cases of environmental change. To answer these questions more systematically, we must turn to the social, economic, and political trends of the century and sketch their labyrinthine links to environmental change. This section of the book attempts just that. The results will prove unsatisfactory. The relationships between environmental and social changes are dense, reciprocal, overlapping, and always in flux. Grand theories that ply a simple answer are of little help. My simplest answer is that in the 20th century, 2 trends, conversion to a fossil fuel-based energy system and very rapid population growth, spread nearly around the world, while a third, ideological and political commitment to economic growth and military power, which was already widespread, consolidated. One has to chop up the seamless web of history to write it. Here I will divide a tangled subject into 7 main parts, grouped into 3 chapters: population and urbanization, energy, technologies, and economics, and ideas and politics. The chapter scheme is a matter of convenience as much as of logic. The connection between population, which comes first, and politics, which comes last, was often real and influential for environmental history, as I hope the final pages demonstrate. All of these themes, moreover, dance together in a co-evolutionary cotillion. Chapter 9. More people, bigger cities. It was divine nature which gave us the country, and man's skill that built the cities. Marcus Terentius Varro, De Re Rustica. Among the greatest distinctions of the 20th century were its powerful twin surges of population growth and urbanization. These trends reflect billions of human choices, conscious and unconscious, made for countless reasons. Some of these choices were individual, such as whether to marry or where to live. Some were political, such as the Australian choice to build a capital city at Canberra in the 1920s and the decision of South Africa's National Party to implement apartheid in the 1940s. All these decisions collectively generated the global trends of population growth and urbanization. They affected everything in human affairs, to greater or lesser degrees, from high culture to child nurture to corporate structure. They affected much that was not human too. Population growth. Most discussion of the social forces behind environmental changes is politically charged, and none more so than the issue of population. Debate often boils down to arguments that other people must change their ways to save the earth. Indians and Africans usually argue that population growth matters little, Americans and Europeans that it matters greatly. My view is that it mattered for some varieties of environmental change, but not others, and that migration was often more consequential than sheer growth. The issue is anything but straightforward. The bizarre population history of the 20th century was the climax of a long frenzy of reproduction and survival. Chapter 1 considered the very long term. Here I will focus on the past 500 years. The globalization brought about by European mariners at the end of the 15th century incubated two biological changes significant for subsequent population history. First, their globe-girdling voyages spread diseases among populations that had previously been long isolated from one another. In the short run, this led to catastrophic losses, notably in the Americas and Oceania. Eventually, the swirl of infection produced more seasoned immune systems, closer symbiosis between pathogens and hosts, and still later, public health systems, so that the toll from epidemics subsided. Secondly, maritime voyagers distributed food crops far and wide, eventually allowing every region of the world to concentrate on the crops best suited to its ecological and market conditions. Maize spread from its home in the American tropics to East Asia, Southern Africa, and the Mediterranean basin. Tropical Africa acquired manioc from Brazil, while the Americas got wheat. In sum, the world's food supply improved. By about 1650, these two factors provoked a long-term rise in world population, still in train. On top of this surge, itself unprecedented in human history, came a tidal wave of population growth. It drew on further improvements in food supply and disease prevention and reached a crescendo after 1950. These improvements first caused declines in mortality, to which some societies later responded by restricting their fertility. In between, when mortality had declined but fertility had not, population grew very quickly. Demographers call the whole process the demographic transition. The rate of growth peaked in the late 1960s. It so appalled observers that a careful and sensitive one, Kenneth Boulding, seriously suggested establishing tradable permits for having children. Growth slowly slackened after 1970, mainly because women acquired more say in many societies and limited their fertility. By 1996, the total annual increment of population had peaked at about 92 million to 95 million more births than deaths per year. Population growth quickened and slowed at different times in different places. The demographic transition began first in Europe, where it took more than a century to complete. In East Asia, it came only after 1950, but took less than half a century. In Africa, it remained unfinished, for fertility by the late 1990s had only recently and spottily begun to subside. Table 9.1 gives a rough idea of the pace of population growth by world region. In the period 1850 to 1950, the populations of Africa, Asia, and Europe roughly doubled. Meanwhile, numbers in the Americas, Australia, and Oceania grew much faster, 5- or 6-fold in 100 years. This reflected both migration patterns and differences in natural increase. After 1950, the locus of fast growth changed. In the ensuing half-century, Asian numbers more than doubled, Latin American population tripled, and African population nearly quadrupled. Meanwhile, Europe and North America grew much more slowly, having completed the demographic transition by 1950. Table 9.1 Regional population, 1750-1996. By the 1990s, humankind accounted for about 0.1% of Earth's total biomass, and about 5% of its animal biomass, ranking with cattle and far outstripping any other mammal. This crowning success of the human species coincided with intense environmental change. Did it cause that change? I will try to answer this with both arithmetic and anecdote. First, the arithmetic. Consider the relationship between global population growth and some global air pollutants. Between 1890 and 1990, world population increased by a factor of 3.5, while emissions of carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas, climbed more than 17-fold. 5. A superficial calculation 6 suggests that population then accounted for only about a fifth of that rise. In the same span, global emissions of sulfur dioxide, a major component of acid rain, increased about 13-fold. Population increase accounted for slightly more than a quarter of the growth in sulfur emissions. If one does the arithmetic for the United States alone, population growth accounted for 31% of the growth in carbon dioxide emissions, in what is now OECD Europe, 41%, in Japan and the USSR, only 2%, in Africa. Less than 1%. Abandoning this primitive arithmetic for the moment, one may safely suppose that population growth had a minimal role in releasing chlorofluorocarbons into the stratosphere. For some important forms of air pollution, then, population growth in the 20th century was a significant, but by no means preponderant driving force. This stands to reason. Combustion generated most of the air pollution, and the quantity of combustion and the intensity of its pollution were only loosely linked to the number of people. In rich societies, such as the United States and Germany, additional people did substantially raise air pollution levels from 1900 to 1970 or so, because they drove cars, heated with oil or coal, and in general increased total combustion. After 1970, new technology, encouraged by regulation, lawsuits, and a decade of high energy prices, loosened the link. Cleaner production and cleaner cars meant additional people caused much smaller increments in air pollution than they had in the 1950s or 1960s. In poor societies, additional people had even less impact on air pollution because they caused negligible increases in combustion. Even where population growth and pollution coincided, as in China after 1970, it is hard to conclude that the former caused the latter. Fast and careless industrialization and, in general, population growth provoked additional pollution of air and water primarily where and when the economy was already industrialized and where society did not value environmental amenities. This was true in the United States, Japan, and Western Europe from roughly 1890 to 1970, in Russia from 1960 onward. Population growth in societies without significant industry had much less impact on pollution levels except for human wastes and domestic smoke. In societies undergoing industrialization, such as South Korea or the USSR, the rate of population growth mattered much less than the rate and type of industrialization. The nexus between population and pollution in the 20th century is hazy enough. But the relationships between population growth and other forms of environmental change are cloaked in still thicker confusion. Population pressure both caused and prevented soil erosion. In places where it drove farmers up steep hillsides, as in Java or northern Morocco, it quickened erosion. Elsewhere it provided enough labor to build and maintain soil conservation schemes, as in the Machakos Hills of Kenya. Moreover, in mountain environments the loss of population sometimes brought on faster soil erosion, as too few people remained to maintain terraces and other soil conservation stratagems. Soil salinization sometimes derived from population pressure, but more often from the temptations of commercial or centrally planned agriculture. Population growth and density were only partial determinants in these equations. Natural, political, and economic conditions frequently carried greater weight. The best conclusion, a rough one, is that population growth often heightened erosion rates, but dense populations, if stable, could lower them. Population growth probably accounted for much of the world's increased water use and intensified problems of water scarcity. A superficial calculation suggests 44% of it. Water use increased ninefold and population fourfold in the years 1900 to 1990, so 4/9 of the century's increment derived from the existence of more people. This, however, is only a rough measure. Changes in water use efficiency, as well as in pricing and subsidies, blur the picture. In the United States after 1980, as noted in Chapter 5, water use declined while population grew. In almost every society considerable slack existed in the water use systems, such as inefficiencies and waste, so changes in technology and policy could, and sometimes did, alter matters more sharply than could population growth. Point 10. Population growth surely played a large role in driving the manifold changes to the biota in the 20th century. Food demand drove most of the century's doubling of cropland, helped fuel the Green Revolution, and multiplied the world's fishing effort. Population growth did not produce these changes alone, but in matters directly related to food production it loomed largest. Some of the important biotic changes, however, had little connection to population or demand for food. Whaling, unlike fishing, did not significantly reflect expanding food needs. Biological invasions had almost nothing to do with human population growth. The vast shifts in human microbial relations had a lot to do with it, but here the causation was reversed. The environmental shift drove population growth. Deforestation admirably illustrates the murky conundrum of environment and population. In some cases, such as rural Ethiopia, recent studies conclude that population growth was the main driving force. But historical studies extending back to the 19th century show scant forest even when Ethiopia's rural population was only a fraction of what it became and when its growth rate was also much lower. Deforestation, in Ethiopia and around the world, occurred in conditions of population growth, population stagnation, and even population decline, example, Russia in the 1990s. Or Madagascar in the period 1900-1940. Point 11. A meta-analysis of the relationship between population and deforestation concluded that while population pressure is an important force leading to deforestation, it rarely acts alone to produce the outcome. Other determinants appear to be necessary as mediation and contingencies for population growth to have a discernible impact. Quantitative analysis suggested that even if the effects of population growth are statistically significant, their magnitude is quite modest. Point 12. Such a vague conclusion, regrettably, is just about right. In sum, population growth accounted for a modest share of air pollution, related environmental changes, and a larger share of those pertaining to water and the biota, especially those involving food production. Big environmental change resulted more often from combinations of mutually reinforcing factors than from population growth alone. The latter probably mattered more late in the century than earlier, mainly because growth climaxed after 1960.13. Migration. Migration often mattered even more than growth, although the two are often hard to separate because growth sometimes caused, or at least helped cause, migration. From 1500 to about 1870, most of the world's intercontinental migrants were slaves or coolies. Then, around 1845 to 1920, the spontaneous migration from Europe to the Americas came to overshadow other currents around the world. After 1925, international migration receded for several decades, and when it gathered pace again by 1960, more diffuse flows prevailed. In all periods, migration often promoted radical changes in land use and sharp ecological shifts. From the point of view of environmental change, the most important migration involved frontier areas. Mass migrations from humid to dry lands repeatedly provoked desertification. 14. Migrations from flatlands to sloping lands often led to faster soil erosion. Migrations into forest zones brought deforestation. With declining transport costs and tightening integration of markets after 1870, people moved about as never before. They frequently ventured into ecological zones about which they understood little. This, of course, has happened throughout human history. But in the 20th century, more people moved, they had more transformative technologies at hand, and in most cases they had stronger links to markets or national planners, giving them incentives to clear more land, plant more crops, graze more animals, catch more fish, or mine more ore than their own subsistence required. The scale was enormous. In the period 1830 to 1920, Europe alone sent 55 million to 70 million emigrants to the Americas, Australia, and Siberia. 15. A large minority engaged in pioneer farming, such as Ukrainians on the Canadian prairies or Italians on the coffee frontier of Brazil. 16. This epical migration wound down after its 1913 peak, restricted by World War I, anti-immigration laws in the United States and elsewhere, anti-immigration laws in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, and after 1929 by the Great Depression. Simultaneously, about 30 million to 45 million Indians moved, mostly as indentured laborers, to plantations in Fiji, Malaya, Burma, Mauritius, Natal, Trinidad, and Guyana. While they took no part in land use decisions, and while most were sojourners not settlers, their labor converted millions of hectares of forest land to sugar, rubber, and other crops. Large numbers of Chinese labor migrants moved to Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, California, and Peru, among other destinations. This coolie trade too slowed under the impact of war and depression after 1914.17. But migration did not stop. It became less international. Millions upon millions of people after World War I migrated into new rural areas. Fewer and fewer people did so spontaneously. Instead, compulsion and state policy took a larger role after 1920, a return to the pattern that prevailed from 1500 to 1870. In some cases, state policy promoted voluntary migration by offering financial and other incentives. Great Britain paid young people, especially war veterans, to migrate within the empire to Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. A few 100,000 signed up, and a few million hectares in the Dominions were consequently broken to the plough. In other cases, state policy forced migrations, as in South Africa. There, the Land Act and subsequent laws restricted ownership of good farmland to whites, obliging millions of black South Africans to move to ostensible tribal homelands called Bantustans. There they crowded onto South Africa's poorer lands, farming steep slopes and running their cattle on semi-arid bushlands, resulting in an archipelago of intense land degradation in that country. Mao's plans after 1949 moved millions of Chinese, accustomed to monsoon agriculture, to dry lands in Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet. Brazil's rulers made settlement of Amazonia a national goal after 1960, calling it a land without men for men without land. In all these cases, mass migration served as a means to political or social ends. Ensuing environmental changes were sometimes unforeseen side effects, at other times they were expected, accepted, or even desired by the leaders in question. Two of the more determined state efforts, involving varying proportions of compulsion and incentives, took place in the Soviet Union and Indonesia. From at least the 16th century, Russians had settled lands beyond the historic Russian heartland. The search for land and furs brought them to Siberia, Central Asia, and Alaska. This epoch of national expansion continued, except in Alaska, through the end of the Tsarist period in 1917. In the final decades of Imperial Russia, the Trans-Siberian Railroad brought 3 million to 4 million Russian peasants in search of free land in Siberia. The government, eager to develop Siberia, encouraged this migration and augmented it with a flow of political exiles. 18 Soon after the formation of the USSR, state-sponsored migration quickened. Soviet settlement in Siberia and Central Asia served two purposes. It was both a punishment for counter-revolutionary individuals and nationalities, and part of the brave new future of economic development planned by Soviet leaders. Mass migration began in 1929 with Stalin's collectivization of agriculture. Between 2 million and 3 million Russians and Ukrainians were forcibly removed to Siberia, the Urals, or the Russian far north. Over the whole Stalinist period, more than 10 million people suffered forced migration. More than half were sent beyond the borders of the Russian Republic, often to virgin land. During World War II, Stalin deported entire peoples whose loyalty he distrusted. 1 million ethnic Germans and hundreds of thousands of Chechens, Tatars, and Kalmyks moved to Central Asia and Siberia in the desperate and chaotic days of 1941 to 1944. Millions of Russians took over their lands along the lower Volga, in the North Caucasus, and Crimea. Stalin was a breaker of nations, and the swirl of migrations he ordered moved millions into unfamiliar environments. Some hacked away at northern forests, others dug canals, built railroads or industrial complexes, while still others tried to till the arid steppe. After Stalin's death in 1953, the Soviet Union used the carrot more than the stick to move another million Russians to plow the Kazakh steppe in Khrushchev's Virgin Lands program. All in all, several million Soviet citizens found themselves toiling away in unfamiliar landscapes, radically altering land use and cover, hydrology, soils, and much else. Their government intended that they should do so, for the glory of socialism and the strengthening of the USSR. Given their struggle to survive, it is safe to suppose notions of soil conservation and forest preservation rarely crossed their minds. 19. Indonesia, like the Soviet Union, incorporated vast expanses that its rulers sought to transform into economically productive areas. It used less compulsion and moved fewer people. The Indonesian scheme was known as transmigration. Most Indonesians live on Java, which together with Bali makes up the agriculturally fertile inner core of the country. The far larger outer islands of Borneo, of which the Indonesian portion is called Kalimantan, and Sumatra, together with thousands of smaller islands, have among the poorest soils on Earth. Java and Bali have long hosted dense populations of rice farmers, who over the centuries carved their islands' rugged terrain into mosaics of irrigated terraces. 20. The outer islands, in contrast, supported scant population, remained mostly under forest, and contributed little to the wealth and power of the state. That state for centuries was a colonial one, run by the Dutch. The Dutch began the Transmigration Project in 1905, acting on ideas in circulation since at least the 18th century. Dutch colonials had long thought that the population of Borneo and Sumatra needed augmenting so that the resources of these islands, notably timber and gold, could be brought to market. 21. In 1905, the Dutch East Indies had about 37 million people, of whom 30 million lived on Java. By awarding nearly a hectare of land to any family that would move, the Dutch induced about 200,000 people to migrate, mostly to southern Sumatra, by 1941. This did next to nothing to relieve population pressure, a stated goal. In its peak year, Dutch transmigration involved 36,000 people. Java acquired this many people every 2 to 3 weeks from natural population increase. Transmigration stopped while Japan occupied the islands and resumed when Indonesia became independent in 1949. Indonesian planners hoped for an outflow from Java of 2 million people per year and intended that by 1987 no less than 50 million Javanese would populate the outer islands. This would alleviate pressures on Java, turn the outer islands into revenue-producing areas, and conveniently swamp their local populations, whose devotion to the Indonesian state at best wavered.
This grand scheme enjoyed the support of diverse backers, from the Indonesian Communist Party to the World Bank, which chipped in $500 million. But it foundered on, among other things, ecological ignorance. Reality proved triply disappointing. Too few took the lure, most who did stayed poor, and the resentments created by transmigration threatened state security more than the process of swamping indigenous people with loyal Javanese helped. By 1987 only 4.6 million people had moved, equivalent to about 3 years' increment in Java's population growth at 1970s rates. The lure had grown to 4 to 5 hectares of land per family. But still the vast majority of Javanese preferred the crowded conditions of rural Java, the squalor of Jakarta's shantytowns, or labor migration to Malaysia to the hardships of pioneer life on the outer islands. Java's peasants were experts at growing paddy rice, but their skills applied in only a few places in the outer islands. Their heroic efforts to clear the forest too often led to poor harvests, dashed hopes, land impoverishment, and abandonment. On the outer islands, luxuriant forest growth derived from constant nutrient cycling between trees and the organic litter on the forest floor. The soils contain few nutrients, as is widely the case in the tropics. Farming successfully in such environments required different skills, normally Swiden techniques. 22 Some transmigrants adopted appropriate techniques, some did not. Some enjoyed strong state support in the form of schools, health clinics, and so on, but others did not. In many cases migrants gave up on eroding lands, on fields invaded by tough and useless imperator grass and other pests. Many found themselves in conflict with local populations on the outer islands, who wanted to farm the best lands themselves. About 20% of the migrants improved their standard of living. Many of the rest felt swindled. By the late 1980s the transmigration scheme had ground nearly to a halt. 23 While it lasted, it provoked considerable environmental change. Had it succeeded as envisioned by its promoters, it would have changed the outer islands utterly. Officially sponsored migration helped decimate 2 of the 20th century's 3 great rainforests, in Indonesia and Brazil. Africa's rainforests avoided this fate in part because of the continent's political fragmentation. Impoverished Sahelian farmers and herders were not encouraged to migrate to Zaire's forests. Had Africa been unified, as Pan-Africanists had hoped, the life expectancy of Africa's tropical forests would surely have been shortened. 24. Around the world, spontaneous and officially sponsored migrations moved tens of millions of people into ecologically unfamiliar areas in the 20th century. A hefty proportion of the world's environmental changes resulted. This was especially true in those categories strongly affected by frontier farming, vegetation cover, biodiversity, soil condition, and, in dry lands, water use. The footprints and metabolisms of cities. 20th century urbanization affected almost everything in human affairs and constituted a vast break with past centuries. Nowhere had humankind altered the environment more than in cities, but their impact reached far beyond their boundaries. The growth of cities was a crucial source of environmental change. First, consider the scale and tempo of the process. A millennium ago, China and the Islamic Middle East had the world's most urbanized populations, but even in these lands 90 to 95% of people lived outside cities. City size was strongly constrained by the nearly stagnant agricultural productivity of their hinterlands and the sharply fluctuating ability of cities to dominate these hinterlands politically. In 1700, only 5 cities in the world, all political capitals, had more than 500,000 people: Istanbul, Tokyo, Beijing, Paris, and London. By 1800 there were still only 6. The hazards of city life, mainly endemic childhood diseases but also epidemics, killed people faster than others were being born. London, for example, in 1650 required 6,000 immigrants per year to stay even. In 1750 London's lethality counteracted half the natural increase of England as a whole. 25 But the constraints on urban growth soon relaxed. Farms were growing slightly more productive. Cities, at least capital cities, were more able to dominate hinterlands. Fossil fuel transport extended the reach of cities farther into the countryside, and public health programs began to take effect. By the late 1880s, city folk in Austria and Bavaria had longer life expectancies than their country cousins. By the 1920s, urban Chinese outlived Chinese peasants. 26 For 8,000 years cities had been demographic black holes. In the span of one human generation they stopped checking population growth and started adding to it, a great turning point in the human condition. By 1900 there were 43 cities of over 500,000, mostly in Western Europe, Eastern North America, and on the seacoasts of export-oriented economies, often in European colonies. By 1990 about 800 cities, scattered all over the world, surpassed the 500,000 mark. Some 270 had more than 1 million residents, and 14 topped 10 million. It remains to be seen what constraints on city size now exist. 27. The first country in which urban dwellers accounted for a tenth of the population was the 17th century Netherlands, propelled by the twin engines of global commerce and unusually rich local agriculture. The first country in which half the population lived in cities was industrializing England, in about 1850. The United States reached this level at about 1920, Japan about 1935, the USSR and Mexico about 1960, South Korea about 1975, South Africa about 1985. In 1998 the world as a whole approached it. 28 In very general terms, rapid urbanization happened in Japan, Western Europe, and Eastern North America in the 19th and early 20th century, in the Soviet Union and Latin America in the mid-20th century, and almost everywhere else after 1960. In national terms, by far the fastest urbanizations occurred in the USSR in the 1930s and in China in the 1980s. Each of these reflected burgeoning industrialization. In the Soviet case, while building communism, and in the Chinese case while dismantling it. Chinese policy under Mao had successfully stalled urban growth, but after his successors abandoned Mao's restrictions in the late 1970s, cities grew with pent-up force. Table 9. 2 summarizes the recent history of urbanization for some large regions of the world. As the table shows, the world's urban percentage tripled in the 20th century. The total number of urban dwellers rose from about 225 million in 1900 to 2.8 billion in 1998, a 13-fold rise. Table 9.2 Urban Proportions, 1890-1990. The environmental meaning of the world's tumultuous urbanization was vast and variable. Urban impacts extended beyond city limits to hinterlands, to downwind and downstream communities, and in some respects to the whole globe. Cities absorb ever larger quantities of water, energy, and materials from near and far. In exchange they pumped out goods and services, as well as pollutants, garbage, and solid waste. Broadly speaking, this process of urban metabolism generated 2 categories of environmental change, pollution effects and land use effects. 29. Garbage and pollution. Rapid urbanization normally generated severe pollution stress. Infrastructure rarely kept pace with heady urban growth. Many people in 1900 and about 800 million in 1990 lived without piped water, sewage systems, gas, or electricity. 30 Consequently they lived amid their own waste and pollution. No novelty in that, most city dwellers from ancient times had lived and died that way. But far more participated in this grim existence in the 20th century, often in ramshackle shantytowns built around urban cores. Shantytown inhabitants usually lacked formal title to their homes, could be evicted at any time, and consequently invested little time or money in neighborhood improvements. City governments occasionally did so, as in Curitiba during Mayor Jaime Lerner's tenure in the 1970s and 1980s, when recycling and public transport attained unusual efficiency. But often they did not, because of lack of funds or lack of concern. The environmental conditions created by speedy urbanization were among the bleakest humans experienced. Slimy water and gritty air were the worst but not the end of it. Consider garbage and solid waste.